general perspectives right around the time when Palantir was starting to get its first big contracts, and the world in general was changing fundamentally with regards to almost everything. Economically, militarily, for better or for worse, this was a pretty important moment. And what he wrote was that America's constitutional system, the rules of our democracy itself, have become a barrier to progress, saying that the checks and balances meant to protect freedom now prevent any direct path forward. And so in this moment of instability, terror attacks, and wars, instead of reforming the system, Peter Thiel proposes something far darker: replacing it. He wrote that instead of the United Nations, filled with interminable and inconclusive parliamentary debates that resemble Shakespearean tales told by idiots, we should consider Echelon, the secret coordination of the world's intelligence services, as the decisive path to a truly global Pax Americana. Basically, Peter Thiel is saying that democracy is too inefficient to save civilization from the existential threats outside, and that real order and progress will have to come from a new kind of power, a power that operates outside the restrictions of government. And so for him, the future didn't look libertarian or even democratic at all. It's technocratic, elite, and hidden. A world ruled not by votes, but by data, surveillance, and the people who control it. And judging by what he was doing with Palantir, and the way that it was a very clear contradiction compared to the rest of his career up till this point, it seems pretty clear that Peter Thiel's idea of what the world should look like had changed fundamentally. And so the Straussian moment wasn't just an essay, it was a roadmap. The same way that he had invested in tech with a philosophical point of view in the years prior, now he was going to do the same, but with a fundamentally different vision than before. With Palantir, Peter Thiel wasn't just imagining a world of surveillance and power, he was building it. And what happened next was going to solidify nearly every idea he had already been playing around with in his head. But he also wasn't alone. Peter Thiel wasn't the only person who saw new opportunities and ideas taking shape as the age of surveillance dawned in the 2000s and the world pretty clearly changed forever. A small but influential movement was quickly gaining clout on the internet with a series of ideas that attempted to explain a possibly more effective replacement for not just libertarianism, but American democracy in general. In their post-libertarian vision, freedom was no longer the goal of all goals. In fact, it would be almost the exact opposite. It all starts with Curtis Yarvin. Just a couple years younger than Thiel, he graduated from Brown University in 1992 and began a career in software development in Silicon Valley shortly after that. But in 2007, he began publishing essays on a personal blog under the anonymous name Mencius Moldbug, laying out a political philosophy called formalism that he saw as a potential replacement for all of the failings of the neoliberal order that dominates the Western world. Yarvin's writings relentlessly criticized liberal democracy, egalitarianism, and the notion of progress in general as detrimental to the advancement of society. He felt that civilization was being run into the ground by an amalgamation of universities and media companies called the Cathedral, who constantly preach a meaningless message of progress to the public while society decays over time. He described democracy as chaos and tyranny in the sense that if people don't actually know what's for the greater good and are being misled by the media, they may actually vote against meaningfully improving the world without knowing. And so Yarvin would essentially suggest that the values that had been passed down since the founding of America, individual liberty, constitutional government, progress, and human rights, had run their course and were no longer stable or useful. Instead, he would suggest a political system that combined corporatism with medieval feudalism, where a country could be run by a national CEO, a role that he described as a tech genius king, someone who had no limits on their authority and could ensure maximum growth and forward momentum for the country.
A monarch, a single focus of authority is, absolutely necessary to run any integrated system efficiently. You could probably put any of the Fortune 500 CEOs in and say, okay, you're in charge of the executive branch, fix this. They'd probably do fine. They wouldn't be Hitler or Stalin.
In a time plagued by economic instability and seemingly endless war as Bush's neoliberal America transitioned to Obama's neoliberal America, Curtis Yarvin quickly built a small but dedicated audience of disaffected, unsatisfied libertarians, technologists, and rationalists who all felt similarly that politics was crumbling under its own weight and a better solution was necessary to push towards the future.
Pretty far out in a way that is worth thinking about.
There's this guy Curtis Yarvin who's written about some of these things.
Are there people in the administration who are on signal groups with me? Yes, there are.
It only grew from there. Not everyone necessarily agreed with his calling for a total upending of civilization by replacing the government with a king, but there were a lot of people in the tech subculture who agreed that there was something wrong with the ineffective neoliberal status quo.
For years, Curtis Yarvin had been writing online about political theory and relative obscurity. His ideas were pretty extreme, that institutions at the heart of American intellectual life, like the mainstream media and academia, need to be dissolved. He also believes that government bureaucracy should be radically gutted, and that American democracy should be replaced by what he calls a monarchy run by a CEO.
Monarch is good, it's a neutral term.
Then came Nick Land. Land had been known as a provocative philosopher in the 1990s before disappearing into obscurity in China while struggling with a drug addiction. But in late 2012, he returned with a series of essays called The Dark Enlightenment, intending to build on Curtis Yarvin's ideas a few years earlier. He would talk even more about the idea of capitalism as a basis for society itself, instead of the long-held ideals like progress, liberty, or humanism. Nick Land would also argue in favor of authoritarian governance, which he thought could provide greater stability, order, and growth than modern liberal democracy. Like Yarvin, he would write that democracy was fundamentally destined for tyranny and that modern progressive ideas had morphed into a secular religion of its own, worshipped by a howling, irrational mob of people while politicians pander as society races towards the bottom. His answer was simple. Build an ultra-capitalist corporate medieval kingdom. Yes, an ultra-capitalist neo-feudal order. Nick Land literally wrote that society needs to return to the medieval era in an ultra-capitalist landscape ruled by an advanced technology with corporate principles. Curtis Yarvin envisioned it, and Nick Land turned it into a serious intellectual statement. But that wasn't all they had in common. They were both also racist. Curtis Yarvin had written that certain races are more naturally inclined towards slavery than others, while Nick Land has written repeatedly about the importance of racial hierarchies.
Not necessarily believe then that certain races would be better at governing a country than others.
Oh, I mean, again, governing a country is just a skill. And, it's like the British in India would basically say, oh, this race is a governing race, this race is not a governing race, based on culture, based on tradition, based on biology.
So you're saying, yes, certain races would be better at running governments than others.
Would be better at doing anything. But
the one thing they didn't have was someone to make their dark vision of the future come true. And yeah, again, their writing was offensive and extreme, but it had come at a moment when extreme ideas felt needed. After 2 wars, financial crash that never ended, and institutions lying straight to people's faces, saying tear it down and crown a CEO was at least worth thinking about to a lot of people. The Dark Enlightenment provided a dramatic answer to the disillusionment of the age, arguing that the only way forward was paradoxically to go back to older forms of authority, albeit augmented by modern technology and knowledge. And for Peter Theil, after spending his whole career trying to innovate technology that could free the world, and now being frustrated and disappointed at the direction that politics, culture, and capitalism was going, these blogs felt like something designed in a lab to personally appeal to him. Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land had created the perfect blueprint to give Peter Thiel's multi-billion-dollar empire of philosophical technology a brand new purpose. He would become obsessed, investing in Curtis Yarvin's software projects and even writing his own essays building on their ideas. And the way that it manifested into his business empire was more extreme than anything he had done before. Because right after, literally months after the Curtis Yarvin-esque blog started gaining traction, came the worst recession since the Great Depression.
Collapsed, the mortgages couldn't be paid, and the banks essentially became insolvent.
The collapse of Bear Stearns was catastrophic. It was a wake-up call to Wall Street. That was a real tell.
Increase in surveillance over private citizens, and then a huge recession increased government spending and taxes and regulation more than ever before. But this is also where Palantir finally finds its purpose, to help Peter Thiel grab power and control. Because if the systems weren't going to function, at least he could be the one behind the wheel. But Palantir was only one small piece of the puzzle. Throughout the 2010s, Peter Thiel's investment career in general took a pretty sharp turn. Thiel's Founders Fund would also invest $1 billion, the biggest investment they had ever made in Anduril Industries, a company making AI-powered surveillance towers for border protection and military use, among other futuristic defense technology. He would also invest in and join the board of multiple European startups focused on attack drones and remote warfare. When Peter Thiel wrote in 2009 that we are in a deadly race between politics and technology, I don't think him going and becoming a merchant of death is what most people would have expected. But sure enough, he had slowly transitioned from investing in apps for banking and social media and instead turned towards weapons of war and surveillance, doing business not with international customers searching for freedom via the internet, but instead, his client was now the government, the very same government that he had once sought to build an escape ladder away from. And so when you combine all this together, you're looking at a pretty different person than who Peter Thiel used to be. His work was no longer about expanding people's collective liberties as much as possible. Instead now, by investing in weapons, surveillance, and war, he's only making the government stronger. Freedom for all was openly no longer the end goal. Now, it was about protecting the very same institutions he had once dreamed of getting rid of. Today, it's the end of 2025, and Palantir's value has skyrocketed, with the company now being worth well over $400 billion. At the same time, though, the company is more heavily criticized than it ever has been. Even more than enabling potentially questionable police tactics in American cities, Palantir has reached a sky-high valuation by achieving widespread adoption around the world. Within the US federal government, it holds contracts with every branch of the military and every single three-letter security agency: the FBI, CIA, DHS, the Marines, the Air Force. All of these departments are now relying on Palantir to more accurately spy on their targets. And reporting from leaked NSA documents revealed that Palantir software is also now used to sift through massive amounts of X key score data, essentially being able to track almost everything that typical users do on the internet. One UK intelligence review warned that Palantir able to view the world's internet traffic completely at will. In Israel, Palantir controversially partnered with the IDF to use AI targeting for adversaries, although the accuracy of their work was highly questioned after over 200 aid workers were killed in Gaza in just a few months in 2024.
So what do you think about the use of artificial intelligence, or lavender, by the IDF in identifying Hamas targets?
Look, I'm not, without going into all the details, I'm not on top of all the details of what's going on in Israel because my bias is to defer to Israel.
Law advocates in the UK have written that Palantir is able to create a 360 profile of individuals and carry out indiscriminate mass surveillance. Most recently, in 2024, they pitched creating an initiative that would link IRS, Social Security, and visa data all in one system, creating a massive database of information about the American people that could be accessed at will by any federal agency. Today, Palantir is also being used in the US to help ICE carry out deportations with a software platform called Immigration OS that tracks immigrants. But whatever it's being used for, the end result is that Palantir is essentially a privatized intelligence agency. And when you combine the size of all the agencies they partner with, they're probably the most powerful one in the world alone. Working with nearly every government agency you could imagine, Palantir's tools give power to cops, spies, and the military to, yes, predict danger, but behind the scenes, they're slowly shifting away the power of surveillance into completely private hands with no democratic control over who gets flagged or why, or how to fight back. This type of surveillance is a violation of personal liberty by almost any definition you could think of. It goes against almost every value we've come to expect and understand as Americans. Palantir is literally a magic crystal ball watching all of us all the time, and it was created by Peter Thiel. And part of the reason why it got that big at all is because 10 years ago, Peter Thiel bought the President of the United States. On July 21st, 2016, Peter Thiel took the stage at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland and said,
I am proud to be gay. I am proud to be a Republican. But most of all, I am proud to be an American.
He would follow it up by saying, nobody in this race is honest except Donald Trump, a statement that was followed by thunderous applause, and from him, a smirk. Peter Thiel had obviously, up until this moment, spent his political energy almost exclusively on futile libertarian causes, as a big donor to Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012.
More than $2.5 million to Ron Paul. Is that not, in practical terms, just flushing money down the drain?
Well, it's flushing money down the drain if you're hoping to achieve power. I think it's an investment in the future. I think the future of this country will be more libertarian.
But Donald Trump was not a libertarian. Trump's promise was something else entirely. His politics were built on a feverish populism that promised rebellion against the elites, a return to greatness across the nation, and a new era of prosperity for all, especially the downtrodden working class that felt abandoned and disenfranchised after the promised recovery from the 2008 financial crisis never came. Trump's Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, came off as profoundly fake and impersonal, another sordid reminder of the corrupt political machine spewing the same old bullshit.
Pokemon go to the polls.
Trump himself, though, was electric.
Awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
Because when someone showed up promising to smash the machine, it didn't matter who it was. It sounded like the first honest sentence that had been uttered in a century.
I had a lot of people, and one guy who was seriously obese. He complained when I mentioned that food stamps, we have a lot of people on food stamps. And the guy went crazy. And they said that wasn't politically correct. Who cares? We all have a weight problem.
But when it came to the vast majority of people in tech, Trump was extremely unpopular because he wasn't just raw. Millions of people saw him as downright disgusting. His campaign was built on controversy, insults, scandals, threats.
This guy, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Maybe that's what I said.
In an attitude considered by many to be downright disrespectful to the office of the presidency, even by fellow Republicans.
Donald Trump's candidacy is a cancer on conservatism.
What about Marco Rubio?
I think he's highly overrated.
I don't think that the way he's behaved over the last few weeks is either dignified or worthy of the office that he seeks.
And by the way, I have much better hair than he does, okay?
In April of 2016, Mark Zuckerberg gave a speech condemning politicians calling for the building of walls.
I hear fearful voices calling for building walls and for slowing immigration. Instead of building walls, build bridges. And instead of dividing people, we can help bring people together.
Tim Cook notably declined to support the 2016 RNC. Elon Musk went on record saying that Trump was probably not the right guy, while Jeff Bezos openly said he seemed unfit for office.
A year ago, you blogged that you didn't have very strong feelings about the election, but that you hoped Trump would not get the nomination. Do you essentially feel the same way about his victory to the White House?
Well, I feel a bit stronger that probably he's not the right guy. He just doesn't seem. He doesn't seem to have the sort of character that reflects well on the United States. It's just.
It didn't take long for the media to put a couple pieces together and realize that Peter Thiel may not necessarily be a fan of Donald Trump at all, but rather he maybe saw his feverish and fanatical style as a possible means to an end. And so when you combine that with his writings that he believed democracy should be replaced with a system friendlier to capitalism, it became kind of easy to see how Peter Thiel probably wasn't that concerned with Trump's promise to bring coal back to Western Pennsylvania. Maybe more so he was hoping that Trump might help achieve his openly stated goal of shrinking democracy to make more room for capitalism. Trump was a candidate known for racist tirades, a candidate that promised to increase deportations, to act with hostility towards the democratic masses that Peter Thiel had long expressed maybe need to be thrown to the side so he can make more money. Even back in 2016, there are articles you can find where people were starting to connect the dots between Peter Thiel's newfound appreciation for the Republican Party and his statements about the end of democracy. Trump gives Peter Thiel a way to fulfill his long-held ambition of saving capitalism from democracy. And Peter Thiel's preferred political future isn't hard to picture. The government shoulders the research costs for capitalists, but makes no demands and sets no conditions. An authoritarian leader uses racial anger to set one portion of the population against another and cracks down on those he sees as alien or illegitimate. The state becomes even more responsive to the needs of capitalists and even less responsive to the needs of workers and citizens. What Peter Thiel calls the oxymoron of capitalist democracy is resolved by jettisoning democracy. It's easy for liberals to dismiss Peter Thiel as a comic book villain, but this caricature obscures the fact that Peter Thiel is a sophisticated thinker and a perceptive one. His central observation that American capitalism is facing a crisis is unquestionably correct. From 1920 to 1970, real per capita GDP grew by a staggering 2.5% a year on average. From 1970 to 2014, it slowed considerably to 1.7%. And the slowdown in labor productivity has been even starker. Over the long term, stagnation doesn't just threaten capitalism by limiting growth, it also runs the risk of turning people against capitalism, as their wages and living standards deteriorate. This is already happening, as the popularity of Bernie Sanders' campaign made clear. A Trumpist state could do much to soothe the crisis of capitalism. It could pour public dollars into discovering the next lucrative technology for the private sector while holding the line against the redistributive clamor of a rising millennial majority. Basically, it seemed clear to pretty much everybody that Peter Thiel was hoping that Donald Trump would divide America so much that no one would be able to agree on whether or not you should kind of dismantle capitalism in the sense that Peter Thiel wanted it, unrestricted, able to innovate whatever he wants with absolutely no care for the greater good of the common people. And his bet, at least that Trump would be elected, paid off. And not only that, but by investing in Trump at a moment when absolutely nobody else would even stand in a room with the president, Peter Thiel had bought himself an unmatched level of influence thanks to the same foresight he had always had throughout his career. And now, he was going to create a politician from scratch. The same way that he had spent the first half of his career investing in and guiding companies, Theil had been investing in people for a long time as well. He once famously paid a bunch of undergrads $200,000 each to drop out of college and start their own companies, and it was famously easy for students who contributed to the Stanford Review during their time at Stanford to find work at his companies after graduation. Even more than that, his list of mentees includes huge names like Sam Altman and more. But in 2011, he started out on the journey to create a politician. In the spring of 2011, Peter Thiel gave a talk at Yale Law School where he argued that there was a big bubble forming in America, but it wasn't anything related to business or financial markets. Instead, it was higher education. He would talk about prestigious degrees having little purpose besides to funnel people into unfulfilling bureaucratic jobs that have little to nothing to do with genuine innovation. And one person who attended that talk was J.D. Vance, a 27-year-old former military journalist who was now pursuing a law degree at Yale. The story goes that the speech had such an effect on him that he realized he didn't want to practice law as a career, but instead do something much more impactful with his life. And so a couple years later, after he had practiced law for about a year, J.D. Vance follows in Peter Thiel's footsteps and goes to work in Silicon Valley in venture capital. But even from there, though, he would only grow further. In 2016, he releases a book about his impoverished childhood in Ohio, and the perspective of someone who was both from the poorest part of the country and successful in the world of tech quickly became the subject of national interest.
So you combine all that, the hopelessness, the despair, the cynicism about the future, the childhood trauma, the low social capital, and you begin to understand why me, at the age of 14, was ready to become just another statistic, another kid who failed to beat the odds.
And while his book was often described as an explanation of the Trump phenomenon,
you understand Trump supporters more than most people do, especially the white working class we were talking about, who overwhelmingly voted for him. You also wrote about your and their struggles in your book.
That the so-called coastal media didn't know a whole lot about, and hopefully my book shed a good light on those folks and help people understand why they were struggling and why they were concerned about their futures.
Vance himself would vocally speak out against Trump as a self-described never-Trumper.
I'm a never-Trump guy. I never liked him.
He once said, "Trump is cultural heroin. He makes some people feel better for a bit, but he cannot fix what ails them." He would even say that Trump was leading the white working class to a very dark place, and that he might become America's Hitler if left unchecked.
Trump is a really bad candidate, and frankly, I think a really bad person.
But in 2020, J.D. Vance moved back to his home state of Ohio, far from the career in media and venture capital he had been building for the past decade, but very close to a possible entry into a political career at home. And sure enough, not long after, he announced a run for senator. At that moment, J.D. Vance was probably one of the last people Donald Trump ever would have endorsed. But J.D. Vance wasn't really running alone. He had an advantage that most candidates couldn't even dream of. Because as it turns out, J.D. Vance's career wasn't just inspired by Peter Thiel, in fact, it was paid for by him. The venture capital companies that Vance had worked at after school were Peter Thiel's companies, and J.D. Vance's political campaign was also paid for almost entirely by Peter Thiel, who spent $15 million, more than Vance's entire campaign raised on its own, on a super PAC that ran video ads supporting J.D. Vance. His only problem was that he had left behind a long track record of detailed critiques of Donald Trump's politics just a couple years before he was trying to get into the Republican Party. But in reality, again, that wasn't really going to be a problem at all. After all, Peter Thiel was Trump's most prominent ally in Silicon Valley and J.D. Vance's biggest donor. And so with Peter Thiel's money and network clearing the path to get a Trump endorsement after insulting him in years past, it was an obvious choice for a former never-Trumper to rebrand as MAGA. Ultimately, there was no way he was going to win without it. And so Peter Thiel didn't just influence J.D. Vance's political career, he created it. If J.D. Vance hadn't been able to get Trump's endorsement, which he got through Peter Thiel, he never would have entered the Senate, and he obviously wouldn't have become vice president less than 2 years later. There's a lot to be said about J.D. Vance having completely switched his political ideals in exchange for power and influence, but somehow that really isn't even the part that matters. What matters is that Peter Thiel was able to buy his friend a seat just a heartbeat away from the presidency.
He had the support of billionaire Peter Thiel.